Thanks everyone for tuning in either live or on the recording. Today we have a special guest, Adam Kaufman. He brings a lot of experience in healthcare innovation and longevity medicine. So, by way of background, Adam has had a really amazing journey through scaled up digital health and healthcare ventures. Notably, he was a key leader at Weight Watchers, where he helped to run some of their new businesses. He can share more about his work there and how big companies are seeing this space, look at this space from the standpoint of scaling, which I know is a goal of a lot of you. He also has had a stint from an investment perspective looking at the GLP-1 space and how some of the trends there are creating business opportunities. Most recently, and most notably for this group, he has spent a lot of time exploring this opportunity that relates to how health systems and the conventional medical system are thinking about this new emerging opportunity around longevity. And I think that's going to be especially interesting to this group because a lot of us are coming from those systems. We were trained in those systems. And we also recognize the flaws of those systems, which is why we're seeking out a new way. But we also recognize that the health systems of today are how most people access healthcare. If we are serious about distributing this to as broad a population as we can, we have to think about how health systems are involved. I think Adam is going to have a really useful perspective, having looked at this opportunity for quite some time, probably knows more than almost anyone about that particular opportunity space. Let me turn it over to Adam and please add more detail to what I just shared, and then we can dive into questions that I have prepared. And as always, for people who are live on the audience, please drop your questions into the chat, and we will get to those as we move through the conversation. Thank you so much, Adam. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anant. I'm so glad to be here with you guys, and hopefully we'll have a chance to participate in future weeks. By way of background, my parents are both physicians. My mom is a pediatric endocrinologist and got very interested in policy. She was president of the American Diabetes Association in 2002, which is important for the broader longevity space. That was the year that the diabetes prevention program went broad. She spent a lot of time with the Secretary of Health and Human Services talking about diabetes prevention. While not exactly what longevity and proactive medicine is, it was one of the first times that we got prevention into the general zeitgeist. From an early age, I saw that happening, which meant I didn't want to have anything to do with medicine. I'm actually an engineer by training. I spent a number of years in the dot-com world. I then did grad school in economics, but found my way back to healthcare by applying economic tools into healthcare. Got smitten by putting those things together. Have spent my career in and around digital health, virtual care, proactive care. As an entrepreneur, co-founded and led one of the early chronic condition management companies. I ran the healthcare business at Weight Watchers, which meant both thinking about how Weight Watchers, which historically has been a consumer business, actually got into healthcare, meaning how do we build programs for people with diabetes and other approaches, and also how did we sell to enterprise clients. I did a stint at a private equity firm that was thinking about rolling up weight management clinics. That evolved into looking at rolling up integrative medicine clinics. This was sort of 2022. So we could talk about the state 2023. We can talk about the state of the industry at that point. For the last several years, I've been working with large health systems, most recently with Baylor Scott and White in their innovation in virtual care. As Anant referenced, we had a big project considering, and the end of the story is we decided not to pursue it at this time, starting new clinics in collaboration with the health system infrastructure that would deliver primary care. We'd give patients vaccines, do longevity style diagnostics, co-locate physical therapists, dietitians, and other ancillary providers in the clinic. We'd be much more forward in terms of the kinds of diagnostics and interventions we ran. So have been along the proactive health journey, looking at it from the vendor side, the technology side, and now the health system side.
Thank you so much for sharing that background. You've certainly had a broad tour through this space and now have landed in this longevity space. I'd love to start by asking you to provide a little bit more detail about the project you just alluded to, if you're willing, as much as you can share about what you looked at with Baylor Scott and White, why they were interested originally, and walk us through the summary of how you found that opportunity, what you looked at, and why you arrived at the conclusion that you did.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to share, as much details as I can. There's a couple things that are proprietary, but very little that I can't share. I would start by saying that Baylor Scott and White is a very large regional health system, one of the largest in the country, the major player in Dallas, Austin, and the corridor that links those areas. It's different from most health systems in that its core organizing strategy is to be customer centric. And so if it's relevant now, we can go into like my point of view and sort of how Baylor would think about different high level strategies as that might impact how different health systems approach this. But Baylor has been on a journey for 5+ years, if not longer, to become customer centric in the way we'd think of any other sort of consumer company. And so within that, they have a whole area that is looking at customer needs, and we use customer to mean patient, where are patients going? And so we've got a whole list of areas that we think of interest to customers. Not surprising, you can imagine, better access to mental health services is on there, improved musculoskeletal journeys, a lot of tech-enabled services. And actually at Baylor, we built a number of those. But sitting on that sort of list of categories, and if any of you have ever worked in a venture capital firm or private equity firm or an innovation, they like to throw Post-it notes on a board that are like here. So one of the things sitting there was longevity, a Post-it that said longevity. It had been sitting on this sort of down select process for a while. Towards the end of last year, as we had finished some of the evolution of other services we were working on, we started thinking about what's next. I've been personally interested in the combination of proactive care, prevention, redesign of primary care for a long time. And so was able to, among a number of other ones, say, hey, let's pick longevity off of that list and let's pay attention to it. We spent about 2 months relatively informally at the back part of last year. We went out and looked at what was going on in the industry. We did some informal research with consumers, and we developed a thesis that what was sort of missing in the space and what would make the most sense for Baylor, I can say more about why we felt this was a need, was not longevity services in isolation, but figuring out how to deliver these kind of proactive care. I can be more specific about how we parse the industry into actual care delivery in a way that would seem connected to, or at least not antagonistic to, the health system. Part of what we felt was if we looked at a lot of the early companies that were scaling, that had received investment and called themselves longevity companies, we felt at best they were sort of adjacent to standard care. They weren't really integrated. They didn't make a big deal about how they would connect to health systems. From a health system standpoint, at worst, they were actually antagonistic. And I can tell you there's a segment of consumers who believe that big healthcare is the problem. And so I think a lot of these early companies were sort of selling into this idea that the hospital, the doctor, they don't care about you and we actually want to give you something different. What we found through our consumer research was that there's actually the kind of coming bolus of people who are interested, who want that kind of proactive prevention, want that kind of care, but don't want to be antagonistic to the specialist they might need. And so we developed this thesis to finish the project. In February, we went to the group and asked for actual budget, and they assigned us a budget. I got to take on the title of entrepreneur in residence, and we were funded for basically a project from beginning of March through August to do a much, much deeper dive into what the competitive market looked like. We did several rounds of consumer interviews, qualitative interviews where we asked general questions. We then formalized an offering. We did live testing of that, put together a thesis for investment, and ultimately had a concept around new clinics that would be cash pay clinics that would deliver primary care coupled with, as I described, some of these more proactive diagnostics, co-located with sort of ancillary providers, and then integrated out into providers doing kind of other things, but then also connected back to the health system. Really compelling offer, but just to finish the story, in August, we took it to the investment committee, and for a number of other competing priorities, Baylor said not now, given the opportunity cost against it. So the conclusion was they liked the concept. The way they described it is if you had this up and running and came to us, we'd look at it very seriously and probably get involved, but we just don't have the appetite to start something new. So happy to dive into any of that, but hopefully that gives a little context of what the project was and where it went.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I should mention that, in the interest of full disclosure, I did work with Adam and his team in assessing this opportunity. I think that's relevant to mention.
Fortunate to get some of Anand's time to think about what was going on in the market and how to distinguish it. And he was one of several experts who had been, whether it's in longevity or in concierge medicine or adjacent spaces, that we were able to get actively involved in the project.
No, it was a lot of fun working with you and your team. I know that you mentioned Baylor Scott and White decided not to pursue this. Can you share any further details on why? And then the second and bigger question is, how do you think about this opportunity generally, about how health systems can participate in this movement around longevity medicine?
Yeah, let me take them in order. And then maybe the most interesting thing, if you allow me, is a little bit of the insights from the consumer research, because I think part of what we had to parse was longevity is kind of a big word in the sense that it is sort of, some people say it means nothing, right? They're like, oh, this is just what primary care should be. And some people were like, oh, it means everything and it's all this stuff. And so we had a very specific definition. And so it's probably worth kind of giving that insight so you know what we're thinking about. To answer why not, what we were proposing to Baylor was not only a clinical model, not only a relationship between a new clinical entity in the health system, but that we wanted their help to build it from scratch. This didn't exist. We weren't saying, hey, this is up and running in Denver or Los Angeles or New York, and we want to build a partnership with you in Dallas. We were saying, let's fund something from the beginning. At the end of the day, the executives who were the champions, one's retiring, one got promoted, so there's some internal priorities. But at the end, I think Baylor looked at it and said, this is really compelling, but we don't necessarily have the appetite to start it from scratch. Most health systems, Baylor in particular, form a lot of joint ventures. Examples might be ambulatory surgery centers or urgent cares in one area. Their basic business model is to collaborate with the health system to enter new markets. And Baylor does a lot of those. We're very, very fond of these joint ventures where we co-brand and build out and own the delivery of those products inside of our markets, but they're not starting from scratch. Had we been at that level with this concept, I'm pretty confident they would have said yes. We were asking them to actually go and say, let's start from the beginning. And I think that was too much of a hurdle given other priorities.
Got it. And so it sounds like the consumer research and the work you've done indicated that this was a compelling opportunity. In this case with Baylor, it sounded like there were some internal transitions and turnover. For people listening who've never dealt with big enterprises, this sort of thing can happen a lot. Sometimes the degree of success you achieve will have less to do with the opportunity or the overall partnership and more to do with who is your so-called internal champion. Usually within these big organizations, you'll have one or two people who are your point person and will advocate for you. And if that person leaves or gets promoted and can no longer focus on you, you can sometimes be left on the vine. And it can have nothing to do with your product or your service or the opportunity, and it can have everything to do with a people issue. These companies have so many things that they're working on that you're always competing for attention and priorities. And so I think that seems like that was at play here.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say, and we can do a whole section if it's relevant on kind of health system, health plan, I've done both, innovation, but most of them have taken the venture capital kind of playbook. And so there's very rigorous, what you'll hear people internally call stage gates, where like we'll approve something, but the bias and the whole system is set up to say no to the next step. And so the active decision has to be yes, which is very different from an operating organization where you have to make the active decision no. And so the burden is to prove that it's worth going to the next step. And so the default in all of these innovation funnels is to not do the next thing because they know that inertia can keep things going. This is one of those where just, like you said, partly for timing, partly for opportunity costs, partly because of the restructuring of the organization, it just couldn't get across that next stage gate.
Got it. No, that's super helpful. I guess one question that I'm sure is on the minds of people in this group, right? So we have people here who are listening who either run clinics getting off the ground in longevity, or they're running businesses delivering longevity care. Is there an opportunity for them to partner up with health systems? Would there be any advice or guidance for businesses like that to get involved with health systems?
I think there's definitely an opportunity. My experience is that most every provider organization in a region is in some relationship with a health system. At minimum, some clinicians, whether physicians or the other providers, had worked at the health system. There's often kind of informal, sort of referral networks. There may be admitting privileges. So there's a real informal relationship that most practices have with health systems. If you want to start formalizing that, I think the main thing to know is the health system wants to understand the kind of medicine that's being practiced. When you formalize it, what you'll end up with, and this is true in all joint ventures which are now formally structured, is that you'll have what's called a joint quality committee. And what that means is somebody from the clinic and somebody from the health system are sort of jointly looking at what it is. I say this as sort of one of the big challenges for any of these sort of more forward-looking clinics with health systems, which is you're often delivering, if not promoting, services that, at least within the standard protocols of the health systems, they wouldn't say are appropriate for that patient. And there's a whole range of these, and we looked at them, right? Some of these are often things that are completely appropriate. No one would disagree. They're just not covered by insurance, and so the health system can't deliver. So think of that as the easiest, and that's not a problem. There might be others where there's no safety issues. They're appropriate, but they're not offered to that patient population because they're not indicated for it, and we're doing something for a patient population that might be less sick or younger. Then there are things that, I wouldn't call them questionable, but the health system general medicine would be like, I don't know one way or the other. I'm not opposed. I'm not. And then there's things that they'd actively oppose. I think the first question you should ask is how far along that continuum is what you're practicing. If you get to things that the average doctor would say, I wouldn't do it or I wouldn't get paid for it, but I'm not opposed, then you're probably ripe for a partnership with a health system. If you're doing things where they're actively going to be like, that's not what we do or that's dangerous, you're going to have a hard time getting past that. So I think that's the first way to think about it is you're going to have to go and describe your protocols enough that they are okay with it. And at some point may even actually want to sit in a joint quality committee with you governing at a top level. What's the clinical care you're delivering?
Got it. No, it's a super interesting insight. And that's something a lot of us think about. The people who are listening are going to be on different degrees of the spectrum. And this may be a hard question to answer. Do you have a sense of where that line is? Where do you think most health systems are comfortable? What sort of longevity treatments are they comfortable with versus not?
I think I've got a pretty good way to think about the line. The way I would describe it is things that are approved for use, but for whatever reason the basic health system doesn't do, and there's usually one of two reasons. One is it's approved, it's beneficial or accepted to not do harm, a minimum, but it's just not covered by insurance. So I'll give you an example, I think there, which is like putting CGM on people who don't have diabetes, right? I don't think anyone says that's dangerous. There might be a disagreement on how beneficial, but you're not going to run afoul of anyone who's like, I'm morally opposed. I think you're stretching boundaries of what science is by putting CGM on someone with pre-diabetes or even without diabetes. That's the kind of service the health system wouldn't do. You can't get paid for it. It's not indicated, but I don't think they'd find a problem. Likewise, there's a lot of diagnostics that are approved. There'll be a debate about whether you should do it for someone who doesn't have some indication. For the most part, those kinds of services, while the health system wouldn't do it, they understand there's consumer demand, they understand there's some boundaries, and those are the kinds of things that can be approved. The other that would fall in that bucket is a lot of longevity intervention, so that was more diagnostic, are things that we generally think are appropriate but are hard to access in a health system. Co-locating physical therapy, dietitian, stuff that is kind of no-brainers for a patient but just aren't done. I don't think a health system would have any problem with those. When you start getting to therapies that are really off, and then maybe the middle ground are supplements and things that are generally okay, there's no real safety concern, it's just a matter of like, are they right or wrong? And I think when you move into that area, it's less about the medicine and more about how it's promoted. If you're aggressively saying every patient needs X supplement and that's going to change the world, you're going to run afoul, but it's not the care itself. It's sort of like the health system feeling like you're overstepping. And then I think there's a set of interventions that, they'd all think are going too far. Plasmapheresis, maybe some of the spa style treatments, although some of those probably fit into the do no harm. So hopefully that gives a range of how to think about these, and different clinics fall on different degrees of that.
Yeah, it's super helpful. I think that's intuitively what most of us feel about where the lines are. I think each of us personally has our own beliefs and care philosophy. I always tell people the first thing you should do is figure out what that is for yourself. Then you'll find the right patients and the right partners, which can include health systems. So that's super helpful.
And it's probably worth one point on why at least Baylor, if I strip away everything and we're just sort of like brass tacks, business, why they're interested. And some of you may know this, but Baylor is not even the leader in this, but all health systems went through a phase where they felt they needed to own primary care. They felt that they were losing the connection to the patient. In Baylor's case, this is very deeply a belief that the primary care doctor is the front door, and we can't be customer centric if we don't have a provider. But you don't even have to believe that. You could just say the primary care doctors control referral patterns and things like that. And so you saw a lot of health systems figure out how to directly purchase primary care or own them. The business model was, okay, well, this is how we get the referral patterns into the hospital and the specialist. They, in most cases, and I can't speak for Baylor, I actually don't know the numbers, but I can tell you on average, at least as the way health systems account for it, they actually lose money on primary care. Part of what we were promising, and this is part of One Medical's pitch for those of you who are familiar, was, look, you don't have to own the primary care doctor. You don't have to have the opportunity cost of it. You don't have to lose money. We'll be the doctor, but we'll approximate the relationship and the referral patterns that you would have if you did own the doctor. So for one side of this is referral protection. On the other side, from a strategy standpoint, Baylor and other health systems are aware that clinics like the ones you are starting do have a chance to disintermediate the health system and leave them out of the primary relationship to the patient. And so being in those clinics makes sense, puts them back at the direct initial relationship that is both from a business standpoint, coordinating and referring to care, so they get the business model, but also they get that touch point that isn't then saying, okay, don't go to this health system, go to a different one. They are very actively interested in what does their primary care network look like and how do they participate. And so from a business justification, that was the underlying reason that Baylor was interested in this and that we think other health systems might be interested.
Super interesting. I think this idea of health systems becoming more aware of where their bread is buttered is something that I've noticed as a trend. I see health systems falling into one of two categories. One category is people, and I think this is actually a much larger category than people realize. But I think a lot of health systems are just realizing, like, hey, this is just not core to us. We don't make a lot of money from this. It's not something that we're very good at. And so they're actively looking to partner with people. I'm seeing this on the primary care side with certain niche types of care, like women's midlife care, menopause care. Some health systems are just looking for partners to take that off their plate so they can focus on the things they do really well, which is the tertiary, quaternary care.
Yeah.
And then there are others like Baylor Scott and White who are looking to say, hey, how can we participate in this, do a better job, but we need some help. And we want to work with a partner to help up level our own ability to do it. And so I think that that's the trend that's playing itself out now.
Helpful, Anand, to talk a little bit about health system strategies, priorities.
Yeah, that's great.
I think the first sort of split is really important to understand whether the health system is oriented towards fee for service or value-based care. All health systems have a mix of both, but you get a very different behavior when the health system is value-based care. And value-based care would be things like their own health plans, if they're in ACO contracts or MSSP, sort of risk sharing arrangements with other payers. Because in those models, while they are interested in utilization and what's going on, they're actually interested in outcomes and reducing utilization. You do see a lot of health system partnerships with other kinds of providers, often not physically located, but care management and other things that are doing population health in the same way those vendors can sell to employers or payers. And that's a large part of the business. So give you an example, Baylor has, I think in any given year, I can't remember if it's 4 or 6, I think it's 8 million different patient accounts, 6 or 8 million. And we have about 800,000 in value-based contracts. We think very differently about partnerships and collaboration. There are some health systems that are fully, or like their primary sort of strategy is value-based care. So that's one thing to know. The other big distinction, as I'd say, there's probably kind of 4 strategies at a top level for health systems. And I'll lump hospitals into this as well. One, and unfortunately probably the primary one for the biggest number, is just survive. Right? It's really hard right now. Costs have gone up. Clinician salaries have gone up. They're getting cut their payments for Medicaid. Like there's a number of hospitals, and particularly regional or rural health systems, that are struggling to survive. So you'll see some that are just like, we're just doing what we can to not fail. The next is there are ones on growth trajectories. These tend to be the bigger systems, often academically linked, and you'll notice those they're just buying other hospitals. And so they're not really paying attention to anything other than just how do I get a bigger footprint. The third would be the value-based care ones. The fourth would be where I put like a Mayo Clinic, which is we just want to be known for the ideal quality. So like a Cedars-Sinai in LA. And then the last one is the ones that are doing kind of customer centricity. We could give you a rough breakdown, but depending on those strategies, you're going to find different top level. And then within it, each of the service lines have different incentives to do different things depending how you go. So approaching Mayo or Cleveland, your bleeding edge, something that they could never do, and they want the association, right? And you'll often be like, well, why wouldn't Mayo just do this, right? Approaching somebody like a Baylor, they're like, okay, well, how do I own my customer? What piece do I need to own versus what can I partner out? And why shouldn't I own this? But less from I need to be the greatest ever as I want to be the relationships. Those strategies do play themselves out, particularly when you're thinking about big partnerships that cost money and time and opportunity.
Well, thank you. That was super helpful. And I want to ask you one follow-up question, and then I want to get to some of the questions that some people from the group have asked. This is kind of a big strategic question. It's impossible to predict, but you have a very useful vantage point. I see this longevity medicine movement evolving really in one of two ways. One is a world in which this type of medicine becomes part of almost like a parallel healthcare ecosystem populated by alternative delivery channels like med spas, standalone longevity clinics, concierge clinics. And this becomes like a separate healthcare ecosystem that exists in parallel with the conventional delivery system. That's one world. And I think that's a world that a lot of people are betting on, especially the people who are deploying large sums of capital into the space.
Yeah.
There's another world in which this starts with these standalone businesses, but then eventually it catches on in the conventional system and becomes subsumed within conventional care.
Yeah.
And there's obviously in between, but I'm curious from where you sit and from what you've seen, how do you see this all playing out?
You're in the conversation, but Hillary Lynn and I have a back and forth publicly writing letters to each other about this exact topic, and she just answered me. I'm pending my answer to her next week. I'll tease it. This maybe hits on a couple other questions. Let me step back a second. In our consumer research, we identified 4 longevity related jobs to be done. And this won't sound like rocket science or earth shattering to any of you. For those of you who don't know, jobs to be done is just a way of framing what is the person or entity who's buying the product, what are they really trying to achieve, which might be different from the features of the product. When we think of longevity, we've identified 4 jobs to be done. I'll do them in order from the ones least likely to make their way into the health system and stay about to those that will. So there's the I want to live to 150 or 180 or 200, right? You know, different people are pegging kind of different. Right? What's the group like 180 or something? Like there's a whole group trying to, you know, so the Brian Johnsons of the world. Well, that will push standard medicine, and some of it will eventually become part of it. This idea of we're going to do whatever it takes to live as long as possible will probably live at the edges of care. Now, whether there's research institutes who are looking at it and stuff, but I think those by nature are trying to push the way that science is being done. It's going to be hard for a health system with these quality things to get into the business of let me help you live forever or live very long. So I think that flavor of longevity will probably be outside. The next is let me, you know, perform at an optimal level or increase my performance, right? That's another thing. And I think that's remains to be seen. I mean, I think what you're seeing there is less about trying to connect that to health systems, it's trying to connect that to other big institutions like the gyms, like sports. I think there'll be some perform better, maybe for the older patients like in MSK recovery and orthopedics, but even orthopedics is moving out of the hospital into ASCs and sort of is standing. So I think that'll be, we're okay with it as a health system. We're not doing it. The last 2 jobs to be done are don't let me die from stuff that was preventable, right? And I think that's where you see a lot of the diagnostics, the earlier stage. I think those will eventually find their way in. And I think the issue we'll have about whether it's full body MRI or, you know, calcium scoring is less about whether they make sense or not. It's just how we manage the utilization and prevalence of those and who will get covered. Parts of the health system that are doing cash pay. I think a lot of physicians think we're underutilizing those to be. Some are against it, not because they think it's bad, just because if you use the MRI machine for that means someone else isn't getting it. But if you put aside limitations on utilization, I think most physicians, let's do more. They're concerned about the incidentalomas. I think that's controllable. So I think that will make its way in. And we'll always have a little bit of, well, if you can't pay for it, you can't get it. And it's not that different from the executive physicals anyway that were already part of the health systems, right? And then the last one, which is I want my health span to move to my lifespan. I feel very strongly that that will make its way into the health system. I think that's what most clinicians in my experience want to do. And the reason they can't is it's not designed to do. They don't have time with the patient. So how we get that in there and what can get paid for versus what's cash versus what's not, I think we need to work through timelines of payments and the pressure on it. But I feel pretty confident that will make its way into traditional care. 4 jobs to be done. What I can tell you is the consumers tend to think of, and maybe because we're doing our research right after Don't Die came out, as, you know, live forever, live to 180 is what longevity means. So if longevity further becomes that, I think that will still be outside. But if we think of this broader tent of what we mean by it, I think a good portion of that will find its way in traditional medicine.
Well, I absolutely love that. People here may know, if they don't know already, that I have a weak spot for frameworks. Maybe it's because I went to business school. That is an excellent framework, and I look forward to seeing you elaborate on that on LinkedIn in your letter back to Hillary, who's also a really thoughtful person in the space. If you guys aren't already following Adam on LinkedIn, I would highly encourage you to do so. He does a lot of interesting content from a business and strategic perspective. What he just shared is a great example of why he's somebody worth paying attention to and listening to, because that is a really excellent framework. And I think as for us building businesses, going back to that question of where we draw the line for ourselves, this is an input into that too, right? To what extent do you want to interface with the core of medicine and perhaps even see competition? I do think the people who are focused on building more lifestyle and prevention focused practices have to think more seriously about this than the people who are operating at the cutting edge and are leveraging peptides and plasmapheresis. Not to say that both can't be really great businesses, right? That doesn't mean that you shouldn't pursue those, but you just should think about everything that's in the picture. So I think that's awesome. Let's turn to some questions. There are a few that have built up here. The first is, and I think this is kind of a good follow-up to what we just said. Do you think health systems are willing to invest into research or protocols that aren't yet kind of proven, but maybe with some research, with some clinical trial could enter that stage? Do you think health systems are interested in engaging in that way?
So let me say yes and no. And the no is, and again, apologize for some of you may know this, but health systems never invest themselves in research. Health systems conduct research that is funded by NIH and government funding, private industry like pharma and medtech, or sometimes donations. So if your primary question is, do health systems have money to conduct the research? I would say almost never are you going to get a health system to put their own money up. Health systems are very interested in doing the research conditional on someone funding it. You can occasionally get lucky and get a researcher who's super interested who can also help get funding or knows how to write a grant. But the health system itself will almost never be like, here's money to go do this research. So if the question is about where the money comes from, the answer is no. If the question is, are health systems and the researchers within it interested in pushing the envelope? Absolutely. Most health systems are connected to academic centers. They're all publishing. They all want to do rigorous formal research. So you have to parse the question a little bit, but hopefully that helps answer.
No, it's super helpful. What are your thoughts on trying to appeal to those who perhaps do not align with some of the longevity and health span stereotypes? I'm guessing this question's getting at the Brian Johnson, Dave Asprey type people, but who want preventative care beyond what is offered in conventional healthcare systems, including some cutting edge. I think what this is really getting at is your user research that you did and where you see people's beliefs and goals lying. What did that distribution look like?
Yeah. So let me answer from both the consumer and the clinical. On the consumer side, not exactly, but it's easiest to think of it in this bucket. I'd say, and again, we were doing a more selected group. We were targeting towards a middle-aged population. These tastes and things do vary dramatically by age. So think of this as a 40 to 65-year-old population. It's probably directionally correct in others, but there's about 10% of people, surprising to me, who are just sort of like, yeah, it's okay the way it is. Like, I don't want a better health system. I mean, obviously they want when they're sick. But if you put those aside, you roughly break down about 25-ish% are, like, I don't want to do this with the health system. I want to do it on my own. Like, I don't trust the health system. I'm going to find the right clinicians, but I'm going to push the envelope myself. Sort of think of this as like the extreme of the quantified selfers who are actively antagonistic to general care and have been told that the health system industrial complex, the farm industrial complex is what's making you sick. There's about 10% who aren't particularly interested in longevity kinds of things, but want their doctors to be more proactive and help them do stuff. And then I'd say that 50% that's left want more proactive. They want to be more in control. They want the kinds of prevention you're talking about, but they'd love to do that with more standard concierge style care. So hopefully that helps break it down. From the health system standpoint, there's certainly people who are pushing the envelope, but the health system is an organization run by committee. So like you're going to get a push to the middle, and the default generally, unless you have a department chair who's really, really powerful and he or she can push something, is what do the professional associations say, right? So for the most part, they're going to appeal to American Diabetes Association protocols, the cardiologist protocol. You don't really move the health system, you move the professional societies where these physicians work, and that moves health system. Again, there's always, the executive physicals that are doing and things that are pushing, but the broad base of how medicine is practiced is standard of care based stuff. And then what's covered by insurance is an overlay to that.
Got it. Thank you for answering that. I think there are a range of perspectives here, and some are based on sound information, some are not. That's the battle we have to continue fighting around who's benefiting from what in all of this, but that's super helpful. In terms of the jobs to be done framework, so many people who are listening are single practitioner clinics.
Yeah.
What do you think the job to be done framework is any different for a very small clinic, or do you think we think about it the same way?
It depends a little. Historically, independent practices have been more about attracting patients in a community. By definition, if you're serving a community, whether that's a community of interest or geographic, you can't really focus on jobs to be done because it's a diverse community by definition. It's this mutual interaction with what the community wants. Jobs to be done can be a helpful framework in just thinking about what the people want, but the typical way that the jobs to be done is to sort of anticipate what someone wants and then design your service to it. So the typical kind of small practice is a taker of who's there and then you serve who's there. Increasingly, virtual care practices, venture-backed practices, sort of marketing forward practices in urban areas are out trying to acquire patients of a certain type, either age, demographic, or certain needs. In that case, having clarity around what core jobs you're doing is really important because it lets you say, okay, this is the thing that my customer segment wants. How do I go find and attract people who want that? And then what's the service? If you're trying to deliberately say, I need middle-aged men who are feeling sluggish, my service is some combination of diagnostics and hormone and physical therapy, it's helpful to know the job to be done, because what you don't want to do is then attract a bunch of people who don't need the service. You got to figure out how to attract them. I think it's very valuable as a business founder, but all the businesses I found have been deliberate about like a certain market and how you want to do it. If you're more in the community style clinic, it never hurts to do it because you can understand what your patients or your customers want. But it's really most valuable when you're like, this is what they want, this is the service. Now I got to think deliberately about how I acquire people who want that and match that thing.
Yeah, it's a great perspective. I would add that there might even be a fifth job to be done. And I think this relates to having a really close personal relationship, which is somewhat orthogonal to longevity, but I do think it's something that comes part and parcel with what people are looking for when they're looking for this different healthcare experience, a very close relationship with a doctor. And I think that is something that a small practice is in a position to provide, at least at the beginning, right? You really can provide a high level of personalized service and be high touch with people, in addition to whatever you choose to focus on in terms of, is it performance? Is it extreme life extension? Is it whatever? Like the service element, I think is a big thing you're in a position to do as a small practice.
If it's worthwhile not to, the four jobs I described are what we categorize as the longevity jobs. We also identified three what we're calling concierge jobs to be done. And the job to be done of the personal access is, in my opinion, the product that solves some combination of the three jobs. One is I just want healthcare to be easier.
Mm-hmm.
That translates to I can get to my doctor faster. I don't have to wait in line. That translates to care navigation. I want my doctor to help me find the cardiologist. I want them to manage it. I want my doctor to be proactive, which is related, but you can see as a separate job. In other words, like one is I tell them I need, and the others, and then the third is I want my physician to quarterback my care. They're all somewhat overlapping. Even within those, the kind of personal relationship you have is different depending on those jobs, right? If this is a relatively healthy person who wants you to help them feel like you're doing what's right, that's a different service than if this is a person who wants you to quarterback their care to their cardiologist, their oncologist. It's helpful, I think, to even parse that fifth job as you described it into its subsets. They really do depend on patient population. Historically, the concierge practices have been for seniors or those who are already relatively sick who need significant navigation into specialists. One of the core primary value props is you're not alone when you go to your cardiologist. You're not alone when you go to your oncologist. You're not alone when you go to the endocrinologist. And when you think about longevity, which is often for a younger population, pre-diagnosed, they don't need as much of that specialty care navigation. So what is that personalized medicine? And that's also personally why I think some of these longevity style clinics will have trouble with patient retention. You do this upfront diagnostic, you get them well, and they don't need you to navigate them. And so particularly if there's a high fee, they're like, oh, I'm kind of okay, I'll go away. And I've heard that even from folks who had a TIA, where it's like, I got better, I moved on, right? So I think that's important to understand what job you're doing and how long that persists, the value proposition, and what someone's willing to pay for it.
Awesome. So this next question comes from Eric, who has had a really interesting journey through healthcare. He was early at Wild Health and now is running a business in the longevity space. He asks, in your search to understand the industry, are you seeking models that offer continuity of care? Example, some clinics are offering costly upfront testing with recommendations to improve the results, with recommendations to repeat the test again. In many times, the patients are basically left trying to figure out what to do themselves. On the flip side, models that are offering continuity are positioned to ensure patients are monitored, make sure they're achieving their goals. Basically, he's asking, like, is there, as you look at the market, where is there more opportunity? Does it have to? And I think you can see the question too.
Yeah.
So I would love your thoughts on
Yeah,
it.
it's a really good question, Eric. What I can say is we formed our business thesis precisely feeling that there weren't enough places that were doing ongoing care, and thought that was important for two reasons. One is what I just described, which is I think a lot of these, so take a place like Function Health. I mean, I think it's a really important service. Let's assume it's helpful one time. I'm not sure the persistence of that, right? Because not only do I need someone to interpret it for me and tell me what to do if I have any problems, but what good is the next test if I don't know? My take on a function is it's really compelling and interesting. Someone hasn't done it. It opens the door, but like actually the consumer will want more continuity in how do I interpret the changes of these tests? Did I do well? Did I not? More importantly, like what do I do in between? Our thesis was precisely to build a clinic that would do that. But I think your point is right. There are some people who don't want that clinic. There's plenty of room for like, let's do these diagnostics because a person wants to organize it themselves, or they already have another service that's going to pick it up. My personal take is those are easier businesses to start in the sense that there's less complexity of the service. They're easier to imagine, and you can acquire a customer, you can scale them. And so the market opportunity was to come behind that and say, okay, how do you have more continuity of care? How do you connect that? What we thought was our innovation was not only do we want to connect call it the longevity journey, but we also then want to say, okay, we hope you never need it, but we can actually connect you to the specialists and into the hospitals as well. We can do continuity across not just the well-being and prevention journey, but also your sick care journey if you happen to need it.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that companies making a decision to focus on just one part of the journey or providing continuity of care is also driven for commercial reasons too, right? I think that there is real operational overhead to trying to provide ongoing care. And, a business like Function, at least for now, is doing great just acquiring customers with testing alone. And so for someone like them, the question is not just why could they, but should they, right? I think they certainly could, but do they need to? Strictly, again, this is thinking from a shareholder
It's a
perspective.
really good point. I think it'll depend by service, right? My personal take is it's relatively easy relatively easy and relatively cheap and little barrier to entry to duplicate what Function has done. If you are a clinic that does continuity, you can order the same larger panel at Quest and you can interpret it. But compare that to Prenuvo, even if you could get the RI machine, getting enough volume to do it, wanting to spend the CapEx is a different thing. So I think they're better connected. And I can tell you, Prenuvo is not just saying, hey, we're a moment in time, but they're also deliberately thinking about how they then partner with folks who do ongoing care. They have a concierge practice coordination. They're talking to health systems. So I think the more moment in time point solution vendors are aware that they're doing it. And so the ones then they're thinking about, to Anand's point, how do you extend and do more? Or how do you make sure you fit into an ecosystem that is going to do that both for your patient, but also so you don't get scooped? And it will depend deeply on the business model and the economics of that particular point solution, right?
Exactly. That's a great point. I think that right now, I mean, some of these companies like Function, for example, I believe that they're playing a pure customer acquisition game. And I think their investors are taking a bet. They're basically underwriting losses on the amount they're charging for labs and the amount of money they're paying to acquire customers, with the bet that, like, hey, these people are in our ecosystem. We can connect them to all these other services eventually, but just by having them in our ecosystem, having their data, there's all these interesting things that we can do. It's a different game than most people who are starting clinics. I hear a lot of clinicians expressing anxiety about Function or even Superpower, which is a company that I advise. I always tell people not to do that because they're playing a different game. They're not trying to replace everyday physicians who are providing care. There will always be a demand for that. There will always be a need for people to have this kind of one-to-one support. I would argue that companies like Function are helping to grow demand in a lot of ways because people are getting aware of this. They're getting their test results done. They're realizing, like, holy crap, I need help. And now if you're smart, you can step in and be that solution. Agree with that, Adam?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the functions, I'm not as familiar with Superpower, I know them a little bit. That's a kind of a classic VC game, right? Like you're hopefully marginally profitable on the service. And Mariana, I think you said it right. You're certainly underwater, upside down on the CAC to LTV, but you're sort of betting that you can amortize the acquisition costs, like you said, and across other products. And you can essentially drive down costs, keep your price stable, and eventually grow your way into profitability. And that playbook is played out enough for tech-enabled companies that there's a playbook for it. The vast majority don't make it, but the ones that do return so much to their investors that is a known venture capital playbook. And the ones that we'll remember did it, but we won't remember the 9 for everyone who did, who didn't.
Yeah, I like to say that this is one where it's almost like VCs decide who they're going to mint as winners, and just by giving them capital to keep fueling this loss-making exercise to eventually get to a certain point. Like once you get a certain amount of escape capital accumulation, you can base, and I think Function is there, right? They're going to be there most likely in the end. Whatever the end game is, they're probably going to be there. And I think there probably is room for one or two others. And then it'll be like an Uber, Lyft, or a Hims, Hers, Roman, like this kind of thing, right? I don't think that game is relevant for most people who are listening to this. That's not going to be relevant for you.
I go work for them.
Yeah, exactly.
To advise you on.
Okay, well, I know we're getting close to time. So if there aren't any further questions, let me just ask you, Adam, is there anything else you want to add to what you've just shared? Anything else that people should know or should take away from this conversation? I thought this was outstanding.
No, I really appreciate it. First, I'm looking forward to joining future calls. So, and please do find me. I'm happy to opine. More importantly, I'm happy to be the participant and learn. What I would say, if I just look at it from an industry standpoint, there's a metaphor you hear a lot about industries, but is inning 3 or 4 maybe in this game? Like it's still pretty early, but it's not like the pure startup. If you're an individual clinician, there's such a shortage of clinicians of any type that you can build a business and do well and impact people's lives. But if you're thinking about like, how do you scale this investment? Unless you've got something really novel, I don't think this is like a start from scratch by yourself. Think about what are the pieces, who are you going to partner with? There aren't any real clear winners. We don't know what this looks like. It's a middle inning game. The investors feel the same way. I think it's a really exciting time, but you need to both imagine where it's going to go and have a point of view on that, but also understand how it's being structured now and what's good or bad about it, because there's real stuff happening. There's real capital. What I can tell you is I've talked to a dozen private equity investors over the last couple months. Every one of them has a thesis in this. Every one of them is looking at 1 or 2 companies. None of them, as of the last time I took them, had written a check, but they will. So if that's an indication of like, it's moving, but it hasn't shaped out yet, that's sort of the best I can give you about where it is. The last thing on health systems, I do think health systems will play in this space. Baylor is one of the few that has the capital, the interest, and the capability to get out ahead of the market. There are a couple others, so I would watch those. But for the most part, health systems are conservative, both in how they do things and in what they do. And so they'll come, once there's an established player, they'll come and say, okay, how do we partner with you now? So like, I wouldn't judge by what the health systems are doing the rest of the industry, but they will help sort of solidify those winners and build some of the moats that are needed when they do decide to partner with them.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think that's a great way to conclude as we are now at 11 o'clock. Adam is now in the WhatsApp group, so he is a resource for everyone. If anyone has questions, feel free to tag him. I look forward to having you join future sessions. Adam, you bring a really valuable perspective. Thank you all for listening live. And for those of you listening on the recording, thank you for listening as well. Until next time, everyone.
Appreciate it, guys. Look forward to being part of the conversation.
Take care. Bye.